In the last UK local elections, thousands of people were turned away from polling stations, not because they weren't registered, not because they voted twice, but because they didn't have the right form of ID. Even more shocking, according to official estimates, millions of eligible voters don't hold the accepted photo identification required under the new rules. That means overnight, perfectly legal voters could show up ready to participate and be told no. But here's the part no one talks about enough. These changes didn't happen with sirens blaring or emergency announcements. They came through legislation, technical adjustments, and quiet policy shift that most people barely noticed. While headlines moved on, the rules of the game changed. And when the rules change, so does who gets heard and who doesn't. So what exactly happened? Who is most affected? And could your vote be at risk without you even realizing it? Stay with me, because what you're about to hear might completely change how you see the next election. Number 1. Mandatory voter ID. For the first time in modern UK history, showing up to vote with just your name and address is no longer enough. Under the Elections Act 2022, voters in England are now required to present approved photo ID at polling stations. On the surface, it sounds simple, just bring ID. But the reality is more complicated than that. According to data from the Electoral Commission, hundreds of thousands of people do not possess the specific forms of ID accepted under the new rules. During the first major elections after the law came into effect, thousands were turned away. Some returned later, but many never did. Imagine waking up early, walking to your local polling station, standing in line, and then being told you cannot vote. Not because you're ineligible, but because you don't have the correct document in your pocket. Supporters argue the change strengthens election security and prevents fraud. Critics counter that proven cases of in-person voter fraud were already extremely rare. So the question becomes, is this a solution to a widespread problem, or a fix for something that barely existed? Here's what makes this significant. Not all photo IDs qualify. Certain travel cards and student IDs don't count. If you don't drive and don't own a passport, you must apply in advance for a voter authority certificate, and that requires awareness, time, and paperwork. Ask yourself honestly, if an election were held tomorrow, would you be 100% sure your ID meets the new requirements? Because in today's system, forgetting one document could mean losing your voice, at least for that day. If this made you pause, drop a comment below with one word. Aware or unaware. Let's see how many people actually knew this, and we put serious effort into breaking down issues that affect you directly. So take 1 second, hit subscribe, and stay informed. It's just one click, but it helps us keep exposing what matters. Number 2, millions don't have the right ID. Here's where things get even more serious. It's not just about bringing ID, it's about bringing the correct ID. And according to research highlighted by the Electoral Commission, a significant number of eligible voters in the UK do not hold any of the accepted forms of photo identification required under the Elections Act 2022. Think about who this affects most. Young people who don't drive yet, elderly citizens whose passports have expired, low-income individuals who've never needed to travel abroad, students carrying university ID cards that suddenly don't count. On paper, they are fully eligible voters. In practice, they now face an additional barrier. And here's the hidden problem. Many people assume they are covered. They believe, of course I have ID. But when election day arrives, they discover their travel pass, workplace badge, or student card isn't accepted. By then, it's too late to fix it on the spot. Supporters of the policy argue that free voter authority certificates are available. That's true, but applying requires awareness, internet access or paperwork, and meeting deadlines. If someone misses a cutoff date, their vote is effectively paused until the next election. Ask yourself this. If democracy depends on participation, should participation become more complicated? The danger isn't dramatic headlines, it's quiet confusion. When people aren't sure whether they qualify, some simply don't show up. And when fewer people vote, the outcome shifts. Because sometimes, losing your voice doesn't happen with a ban. It happens with a small technical requirement most people never saw coming. If you checked your ID since watching this, comment checked. If you haven't yet, comment doing it now. We spend hours researching and breaking this down so you don't have to. So hit subscribe. It's one simple click. but it helps us keep uncovering what others overlook. Number 3. Government influence over the election watchdog. Now this is where things move from practical inconvenience to deeper structural concern. The body responsible for overseeing elections in the UK, the Electoral Commission, was designed to operate independently. Its role is simple but powerful: monitor elections, enforce rules, and ensure fairness without political interference. But under the Elections Act 2022, a new mechanism was introduced. The government can now set a formal strategy and policy statement that outline priorities for the Electoral Commission. In other words, ministers can guide the direction of the very body meant to regulate the electoral system. Supporters argue this increases accountability. They say elected officials should have oversight over public institutions. On paper, that sounds reasonable. But critics, including constitutional experts and democracy watchdog groups, have raised concerns. Their argument: when the government gains influence over the referee, it creates a perception problem. Even if nothing improper happens, public trust can begin to erode. And trust is everything in a democracy. If voters believe the system is neutral, participation remains strong. If they suspect bias, even slightly, confidence weakens. Imagine watching a football match where one team sets the referee's priorities before kickoff. Would you feel the game is completely impartial? This change may seem technical, buried in legislative wording. But structural shifts often matter more than headline policies. Because democracy doesn't only rely on who votes, it relies on who safeguards the process. The real question is this: should the overseer of elections answer directly to the government of the day? If this surprised you, comment "referee matters." If you think oversight is necessary, comment "accountability first." We dig deep into these overlooked changes so you stay informed. So tap subscribe. One click from you helps us keep doing the heavy lifting. Number 4. Postal voting restrictions. For many people, voting doesn't happen at a polling station. It happens at the kitchen table, with a cup of tea, filling out a postal ballot. Postal voting has long been a lifeline for elderly citizens, people with disabilities, shift workers, carers, and those who simply can't make it in person on election day. It made participation easier, flexible, accessible. But changes introduced under the Elections Act 2022 have tightened the rules around postal voting. There are now limits on how many postal ballots one individual can hand in at a polling station. New identification and verification requirements apply. Postal vote arrangements must be renewed more frequently than before. On paper, these are framed as security measures. The goal: reduce the risk of fraud or undue influence. Here's the issue. With every additional requirement, the process becomes more complex. Imagine an elderly neighbor who relies on a family member to drop off their ballot, or a busy nurse finishing a 12-hour shift who forgets about a renewal deadline. Small administrative hurdles can quickly turn into missed opportunities, and missed opportunities turn into lost votes. Supporters argue these changes protect electoral integrity. Critics argue that proven cases of widespread postal voting fraud were limited. The debate isn't just about fraud, it's about balance. How do you protect the system without discouraging legitimate voters? Because when participation becomes complicated, people disengage quietly. No headlines, no protests, just fewer ballots in the box. So ask yourself, if voting from home becomes harder, who is most likely to stop trying? If you or someone you know uses postal voting, comment "postal voter." If you prefer in-person voting, comment "polling station." We spend serious time breaking this down so you don't miss what matters. So hit subscribe. One click from you keeps this channel alive and digging deeper. Number 5. Overseas voters. Here's a change that didn't restrict voting. It expanded it. And that's exactly why it's controversial. Under the Elections Act 2022, the long-standing 15-year limit on British citizens living abroad was removed. Previously, if someone had lived outside the UK for more than 15 years, they lost the right to vote in UK parliamentary elections. Now, that cap is gone. In theory, a British citizen who left decades ago can still register and vote, even if they haven't lived in the country for most of their adult life. Supporters call this a correction of an unfair rule. They argue that citizenship doesn't expire, so voting rights shouldn't either. Many overseas citizens still pay UK pensions tax, own property, or a family deeply affected by British policies. From that perspective, expanding the franchise strengthens democracy. But critics see it differently. They question whether individuals who haven't experienced recent public services, economic conditions, or social changes should influence decisions that directly affect residents. After all, domestic policies, from healthcare to transport to education, impact those living in the UK every single day. There's also a political dimension. Expanding the overseas electorate could shift voting numbers in certain constituencies. Even small changes in close races can alter outcomes. So this isn't simply about fairness, it's about who shapes the future. If someone hasn't lived in the UK for 30 or 40 years, should their vote carry the same weight as someone facing today's cost of living pressures? Or does citizenship alone settle that debate? This reform didn't remove votes. It added new ones. And sometimes, adding voices can change the entire balance of the conversation. If you think citizenship should guarantee a lifetime vote, comment citizenship first. If you believe residency should matter more, comment live here, vote here. We research these complex shifts so you get the full picture, so hit subscribe. It's one click for you, but it fuels hours of work on our end. Number 6. First past the post. Now let's step back from recent rule changes and look at something deeper, the system itself. The UK still uses the first past the post voting system for general elections. That means in each constituency, the candidate with the most votes wins, even if they don't secure an overall majority. Imagine 5 candidates running. One receives 35% of the vote, while the remaining 65% is split between others. That 35% candidate wins the seat. The majority of voters in that area technically voted for someone else, yet their voices don't translate into representation. Multiply that across dozens of constituencies, and the national picture can look very different from the popular vote. This isn't new, but it matters more when trust in the system is already under pressure. Supporters argue first past the post creates strong, stable governments and clear outcomes. It avoids fragile coalitions and endless negotiations. Critics argue it distorts representation, discourages smaller parties, and leads to safe seats where outcomes rarely change, making some voters feel their ballot has little impact. And here's the emotional reality. When people believe their vote won't change anything, participation drops. You might have heard someone say, "There's no point voting where I live." That mindset isn't random. It grows in systems where outcomes feel predictable before ballots are even cast. So while voter ID and postal rules affect access, the voting structure affects influence. The question is bigger than fraud or paperwork. It's this: does the system reflect the will of the majority, or simply the distribution of constituencies? Because sometimes, losing your voice doesn't happen at the door of a polling station. It happens in how votes are counted in the first place. If you've ever felt your vote didn't count, comment "count it." If you believe the current system works, comment "keep it." We put serious time into breaking down systems, not just headlines. So hit subscribe. One click from you keeps this research going. Number 7. Youth disengagement. Here's something even more worrying than rule changes. Young people are voting less. Over the past several elections, turnout among younger age groups has consistently lagged behind older voters. While older generations show up in strong numbers, many under 30 either delay registering, miss deadlines, or skip voting entirely. This matters more than people realize. When one age group participates more than another, policies naturally begin to reflect the priorities of those who vote consistently. Housing, tuition fees, climate policy, job security. These issues hit younger generations hardest. But if participation is low, influence is limited. Research from the Electoral Commission shows that awareness gaps, confusion about registration, and a feeling that politics doesn't represent me are common reasons for lower turnout among young voters. Add new requirements like mandatory ID or postal vote renewals, and small barriers can feel even bigger. And here's the psychological effect. When voting feels complicated or disconnected from daily life, it slides down the priority list. Rent is due. Work deadlines stack up. Life moves fast. Democracy starts to feel distant. But disengagement doesn't mean disinterest. Many young people care deeply about issues. They just don't always connect that passion to the ballot box. So ask yourself, if younger generations step back, who shapes the future policies that will affect them for decades? Because democracy isn't only about who is allowed to vote. It's about who actually does. And when millions stay home, not because they are banned, but because they are disengaged, the outcome changes just the same. If you're under 30 and planning to vote, comment "I'm in." If you think young voices need more power, comment "Future matters." We invest real time breaking down these trends. So tap subscribe. One simple click helps us keep giving young voters a voice. Number 8. Protest laws and political expression. Voting is only one part of democracy. The other part happens between elections, in the streets, online, in town halls, and through peaceful protest. And in recent years, the UK has introduced legislation that changes how, where, and when people can publicly demonstrate. One major example is the Public Order Act 2023, which expanded police powers to restrict protests deemed highly disruptive. Supporters argue these measures are necessary to prevent serious public disorder and protect daily life from extreme disruption. Critics argue the definitions of serious disruption can be broad, potentially limiting legitimate protest activity. Why does this matter for voting? Because political engagement doesn't start on election day. It builds through activism, community organizing, and public debate. When rules around demonstrations become stricter, some argue that it may discourage visible political participation, especially for grassroots movements without major funding or media backing. Imagine organizing a peaceful rally about an issue that affects your community. Now imagine navigating new legal thresholds, potential restrictions, and uncertainty about enforcement. For some, that uncertainty alone becomes a deterrent. This isn't about chaos versus order. It's about balance, maintaining public safety while protecting freedom of expression. Healthy democracies rely on more than ballots. They rely on citizens feeling confident that they can speak, gather, and advocate without disproportionate consequences. So the real question becomes, if public political expression feels riskier or more restricted, does that gradually reshape how comfortable people feel participating at all? Because when engagement shrinks outside the ballot box, influence can quietly shrink inside it too. If you believe protest is essential to democracy, comment "Voice matters." If you prioritize public order above all, comment "Stability first." We dedicate serious effort to breaking down laws that shape your rights, so hit subscribe. One click from you keeps this conversation alive. Number 9. Misinformation and the collapse of trust. Here's something even more dangerous than new laws: declining trust. Because a democracy doesn't just run on rules, it runs on belief. Belief that votes are counted fairly. Belief that institutions act independently. Belief that outcomes reflect the will of the people. In recent years, surveys and reports from the Electoral Commission have shown growing public concern about election integrity, not necessarily because of proven widespread fraud, but because of confusion, misinformation, and polarizing narratives spreading online. Social media amplifies claims at lightning speed. A headline, a viral clip, a misleading statistic, and suddenly doubt spreads faster than facts. And here's a psychological twist. Once trust weakens, participation follows. If someone believes the system is rigged, they are less likely to vote. If they think "my vote won't change anything," motivation drops. The danger isn't just misinformation itself, it's the erosion of confidence. Supporters of new voting rules argue they increase security and reassure the public. Critics argue that constant messaging about fraud, even when rare, can unintentionally fuel suspicion. Think about it this way. If people constantly hear that elections are vulnerable, even without strong evidence, they may begin to assume something must be wrong. And when citizens start doubting the process, democracy becomes fragile, not because votes disappear, but because belief does. So ask yourself honestly, do you feel more confident in the system today than 5 years ago? Or less? Because when trust collapses, turnout drops. And when turnout drops, representation narrows. Sometimes the biggest loss isn't the vote itself, it's the faith behind it. If you still trust the system, comment "I trust it." If you feel trust is fading, comment "Fix it." We put hours into researching facts over fear, so tap subscribe. One click helps us keep cutting through noise with clarity. Number 10. Complexity. Here's the final, and perhaps most overlooked, issue: complexity. Not bans, not dramatic headlines, just layers of rules, deadlines, renewals, ID requirements, eligibility updates, overseas registration systems, postal vote limits. Each one, on its own, may seem manageable, but together, they create friction. And friction discourages action. Think about the average person. Busy schedule, bills to pay, family responsibilities, work stress. Now add checking accepted ID lists, renewing postal ballots every few years, understanding overseas registration rights, monitoring rule changes, and staying informed about legal updates under acts like the Elections Act 2022. For politically engaged citizens, this may feel normal. But for casual voters, the ones who vote occasionally, every extra step increases a chance they simply opt out. Research in behavioral science shows that when processes become more complicated, participation drops, even if the intention behind the change is neutral. Humans naturally avoid friction. The harder something feels, the easier it is to delay, and democracy relies heavily on those sometimes voters. The people who may not watch political debates every night, but still show up when they feel motivated. So the real question isn't just, are you allowed to vote? It's how easy is it for you to vote? Because in modern systems, rights rarely disappear in one dramatic move. They slowly become harder to exercise. More paperwork, more steps, more uncertainty. And over time, fewer people show up. Not because they were stopped, but because the system became complicated enough to quietly push them away. If you believe voting should be simple, comment "Make it simple." If you think strict processes are necessary, comment "Protect it." We invest serious effort breaking down complex systems into clear truths. So hit subscribe. It's just one click for you, but it keeps this channel growing and exposing what matters. When you step back and look at everything we've covered, a pattern starts to emerge. There wasn't one dramatic moment where voting in the UK was suddenly taken away. Instead, there were multiple changes: voter ID requirements, postal voting restrictions, overseas voter expansion, structural shifts in oversight, protest laws, declining youth turnout, misinformation, and growing complexity. Each one, on its own, might seem reasonable to some, debatable, technical, administrative. But democracy doesn't operate on isolated policies. It operates on public confidence and participation. When rules become stricter, trust becomes fragile, and processes grow more complicated, something subtle happens. People disengage. Not all at once. Not loudly, but gradually. A missed registration deadline here. An expired ID there. A feeling that it won't make a difference anyway. And that's the real story. The power of a vote doesn't disappear overnight. It weakens when fewer people are able or willing to use it. Whether you believe these changes strengthen security or create barriers, one thing is undeniable. Being informed is no longer optional. It's essential. So the most important question isn't whether the system has changed. It has. The real question is this: what are you going to do about it? Will you double-check your eligibility? Help someone else register? Stay informed about new rules? Or simply assume it doesn't affect you? Because in the end, democracy doesn't survive on laws alone. It survives on participation.